The time in the courtroom was 10:45 a.m. When I eventually got out of my vehicle, I wasn't in a hurry. I let them wait. I let her attend the scheduled divorce court at 10 wa. Sitting in that chair, she looked at the time and whispered sweet nothings to her lover, certain that they were one. She believed my tardiness was a sign of incapacity or hopelessness. But they were unaware. Every tick of that courtroom clock was part of a plan. As I walked into the courthouse, I visualized her face, her sneer, the way she cocked her head in his direction as if they were co-conspirators in a successful heist. Perhaps they would jest about me later. I could hear her laughter in my mind, the same laugh that had made me lose everything. It used to sound like music, before I realized what it truly concealed. But this wasn't just about losing a wife. It was about losing the person with whom I had built a life for 10 years, only to discover that she had been planning her escape. A plan with another man, a man who sat at my dinner table, shook my hand, looked me in the eyes. I had spent the past few months ensuring I would never feel foolish again, not after being one for too long. The courthouse doors squeaked open. I entered the tumult of court proceedings. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't desperate. I was composed. And every step I took down the marble hallway echoed my intent. I wasn't here to lose. My navy suit was immaculate. My polished shoes, deliberate. I paused before the door of room 304, inhaled deeply. The sounds of whispers and soft laughter crept through. Her laughter. It carried me through the heavy timber doors, but I no longer felt anger. It was a diversion. Was alert, focused, prepared. When the courtroom fell silent, I entered. Her head pivoted. Her smile momentarily wavered. She caught herself, then drew in closer to him, as if his presence could protect her from what was about to happen. Her lawyer smirked. "You should join us," he said in a condescending tone. I ignored him. Instead, I made eye contact with her. She raised an eyebrow, masking her face with feigned concern. "You're late," she said, lighthearted, mocking. I spoke coolly, almost conversational, but I couldn't have missed this moment. I sat down at the table, set my briefcase beside me with a purposeful gesture. Her lover, the man who had replaced me, sat in the row behind her. He smirked. Smug. I almost laughed. He had no idea what was coming. The judge cleared his throat, signaling the proceedings to begin. Her lawyer rose first, delivering a rehearsed monologue about my alleged shortcomings, my supposed failures as a husband, my apparent incapacity to provide. It was a show. He was skilled, his words dripping with practiced confidence, but I remained silent, hands folded, occasionally nodding as if I were just another observer. I let them believe they were in control, let them dig their own graves, and when it was my turn, I stood, slowly, adjusted my tie, felt the tension in the room tighten around me. All eyes were on me, but I was focused on only one, her honor. "Apologies for being late," I said, my voice steady. "I had some pressing matters to attend to this morning, matters that will clarify why we're here today." Her lawyer stiffened, caught off guard. My wife glanced at her lover. A flicker of doubt crossed her face. "Good." I turned, back to the judge. "But before we proceed, Your Honor, I'd like to ensure that everyone is fully aware of the circumstances surrounding this case." I reached for my briefcase. The room filled with hushed whispers. She watched me closely now. I could feel her heartbeat quicken. Her lover shifted uneasily. And then, I set the first document on the table. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time in months, I saw something new in her gaze. Not disdain, not arrogance, fear, and this was only the beginning. A count that belonged to Mr. David Carlson, the defendant's lover. Her lover's name hung like a thunderclap, and I didn't glance at him because I didn't need to hear the person breathing. The gallery informed me that the judge's eyes became cold as he spoke. "Mrs. Stanley, is it true?" She stumbled and found it difficult to put her thoughts into a clear sentence. Grant completed his work for her, but I wasn't sure if that money was for personal use. His tone sliced like a razor through her justifications. "Your Honor, we have more." A helper wheeled in a monitor, and a few seconds later, bank statements and transaction records were shown in the trial. Transfers to hotel chains were highlighted, expensive brands, and a $10,000 wire transfer to David, one particularly egregious payment. "Mrs. Stanley," Grant said, "looking at Carlson's account, which is marked as a loan, do you—" While completing these transactions, her expression was a mix of embarrassment and panic. Grant persisted relentlessly. "The $10,000 loan was not intended by me. That meant paying for the man's costs while you were establishing a future with him, who, incidentally, doesn't have a reliable source of income. And David had no assets in his name." David's face flushed, and he suddenly stood, prepared to object. But the judge cut him off with a single stare. "This is really strange." Her attorney made it obvious, desperate to take back control. "My client has the authority to make her own financial decisions. Grant didn't disconnect him. When the money was coming from a joint marriage account, when my client's assets were being mishandled to justify an affair." The judge nodded, his face grim. "Mrs. Stanley," he said, staring at her, "do you have anything to say to support your position?" Her lawyer looked at me as though he was praying for mercy. She finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. There had been a mistake. I couldn't help but correct the miscommunication. "You mean the months of falsifying the financial records?" She quickly looked away. "From the misunderstanding, from the treachery, from the plans to seize everything from me." Grant, unable to match my words, took a back seat and allowed the facts to do the talking. The judge leaned forward, hands clasped on the bench. "Mr. Stanley," he said, turning to face me, "do you have any concluding remarks about these accusations?" I stood, looking him in the eye. "Your Honor, I put a lot of effort into everything we built. If I had trusted her with our future as well as our money, she would have taken advantage of that trust. All I ask is that the court consider her actions fairly and render a decision in accordance with them." The judge nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Stanley. I'll review all of the evidence." I sat down again and glanced at her lover, who now appeared to be a man who understood the weight of his own downfall. They clung to their fortifications, not just to hide their treachery, but to convince themselves it had been worth it. The session concluded with a request for closing arguments. As we filed out, her attorney rushed her down the corridor, whispering angrily. David followed them, appearing less like the arrogant man he had been and more like a kicked dog. I knew I had moved the scales when I left that courtroom. They had believed they were untouchable. But now they were the ones fumbling for their feet. And the worst part was still to come.